Well, it looks like we are live. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I am the host of Global Dispatches, this very podcast, coming to you from world headquarters in Denver, Colorado. I'm joined today by Jordan Tama. Jordan, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Jordan Tama. I'm a professor at American University in Washington, D.C.
And you specialize, Jordan, in public opinion on American foreign policy, which is the topic of our conversation today. So, the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs just released the results of its 2025 survey of American attitudes on foreign policy. And what to me makes this particular survey so interesting is that they have been doing it for nearly 50 years. In the wake of the Vietnam War, the Chicago Council, conducted its first big survey of American attitudes on foreign policy, and they've been doing it very consistently over the last fifty years, which gives me and us and everyone and you the opportunity to, take kind of like a big picture view of trends and trajectories of American perceptions and American views of foreign policy. And they do so in a kind of bipartisan way, in the sense that they, ask people, are they Democrats, are they Republicans, are they independents? And in so doing, can measure where there is consensus and where there is divergence in foreign policy views. Jordan, I wanted to kick off asking you, broadly, up until somewhat recently, there has been a general bipartisan consensus, not just among like elite foreign policy makers, but among American voters on what ought to be American foreign policy priorities. Like, what were the elements of those consensus?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The real value of these Chicago Council surveys is that they've been getting done repeatedly over time every year for 50 years. And so it's a great way to look at these long-term trends. Overall, there has long been um, consensus in support of an active U.S. role in the world. If you kind of think about foreign policy from the broadest sense, one of the questions that the Chicago Council has asked every year since 1974 is, do you support an active role in the world for the United States? And most Americans have consistently supported that. Typically, about two-thirds of Americans have said they support an active U.S. role in the world. That's down a bit in recent years, so it's now down to about 60%, but still most Democrats and most Republicans generally favor an active U.S. role in the world. Um, a little bit more specifically, there has long been consensus in support of the United States working with allies and partners as a central part of its foreign policy. So most Americans, and this is true of Democrats and Republicans as well as independents, think that alliances are beneficial to the United States. They favor maintaining or increasing the U.S. commitment to its core alliances like NATO and alliances in Asia with Japan, Korea, other countries. That actually remains true today, even during the Trump era, which is striking because Trump has been a sharp critic of a lot of our allies. That message has not um, led support for alliances to collapse in the United States. So that's some positive news. And generally, Americans have felt that the United States has an important role to play in addressing international problems. Um, the other area of, I'd say, broad consensus for a long time has been the role of the military. Americans generally think the United States should have a powerful military. There is some partisan split on how much the U.S. should invest in the military. Republicans are more favorable towards heavy levels of military spending than Democrats are, but Americans generally feel the U.S. should be prepared to address security problems militarily. Those are, I'd say, the areas of broadest consensus.
And historically, those have been areas of broad consensus as well. I mean, you think today, in the context of how deeply partisan our politics have become and how polarized our politics have become, the idea that like 60% of Americans can agree on anything is kind of remarkable.
Right. Yeah,
Um,
no, it is. And there's real variation here. That's one of the things that stands out if you look at the data. There are some issues where still Democrats and Republicans to a large extent, see things pretty similarly, and then there's some foreign policy issues where there are vast differences between Democrats and Republicans.
So because this survey has been asking similar questions over the last 50 years, you can see trends over time. And one of the trends reported in this survey is a fraying and unraveling of that broad bipartisan consensus among several issues. Can you just kind of walk viewers, listeners through what are some of the areas in which that consensus is fraying? And then we can talk about why that might be.
Yeah, there are a number of issues where consensus has really frayed and where there are sharp divides between Democrats and Republicans. Now, climate change is one of them. Um, Most Democrats see climate change as one of the most serious threats to the United States. Um, Few Republicans see climate change as a major threat to the United States. Immigration is another. Um, Most Republicans see immigration as a major threat to the United States. Most Democrats do not. Um, some specific kind of countries or U.S. policy toward countries also generate partisan division. So Israel has become an issue where there's now more partisan division. You go back 20 years, most Democrats and most Republicans were strong supporters of Israel. Most Republicans still are, but most Democrats now have unfavorable views toward Israel and think the United States should reduce its support for Israel.
Mhm,
Um, Ukraine, we see some partisan division. Democrats are still strongly pro-Ukraine. Republicans are split on Ukraine. Some Republicans still think the U.S. should continue providing support for Ukraine, but others think it's none of our business and we should stop aiding Ukraine.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. You can kind of like break down some of those issues, and it's sort of intuitive why there would be that divide. Like in Israel, I think, most Democrats probably interpreted Israel's conduct in Gaza as like an affront to liberal values, and caused most Democrats or liberal leaning people to, withdraw their support. Again, it used to be an area of bipartisan consensus, but you seeing Democrats drifting one way. On Ukraine, presumably that's because mostly of Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's right. And on a lot of foreign policy issues, the public to some extent, will follow cues from their leaders. And we've seen this in recent years with much of the Republican electorate following cues from Trump. Trump has, uh, spoken favorably of Vladimir Putin. He's spoken critically of Vladimir Zelensky, and this has shifted Republican attitudes to be somewhat less positive toward Ukraine than they would otherwise have been. That said, there are still limits to how much the president can influence, what voters think, and even within the Republican electorate, there are still a sizable number of Republican voters who see the world
Mhm,
differently than Trump. There are still, uh, many Republican voters who think allies and partners are important, who think NATO is important, who think Trump is using tariffs too much. So yes, Trump is having a big effect on the Republican electorate, but um, he uh, he doesn't dictate how every Republican voter sees the
mhm.
world necessarily.
That's interesting. I've been kind of doing this for a long time, for about 20 years, covering the UN in particular. And I do remember, Gallup, which has been taking surveys about the UN since like the 1950s. You saw in the context of the US invasion and occupation of Iraq and the Bush administration turning against the UN for the fact that the UN Security Council didn't like approve or support this, and
Yeah,
kind of you saw like a kind of a right-wing media ecosystem kind of relentlessly attack the UN in that time. That support broadly for the UN dropped significantly in that period in the early 2000s. So I do take your point about leaders having an outsized impact on how voters view certain institutions and certain foreign policy ideas.
yeah, that's right. And we also see now an interesting kind of reverse effect where Trump influences Republican voters, many Republican voters, to adopt his perspective on issues, and we see that a lot on immigration. I mean, the Republican electorate became more strongly anti-immigration when Trump started railing against immigration during the 2016 presidential campaign. But Trump has also led Democratic voters and many independents to value international cooperation more because they see
Uh-oh, I think you're getting a call here. We'll take a moment there. You can uh
yeah, no, I cut off the call. I'm so sorry about
no,
that.
no, it's okay.
I should
Here,
have,
go
yeah,
back to the story we were saying about the point you're about to make. We can
yeah.
edit this out
Um,
during the not live stream, so it's all good.
I appreciate that. And I'm gonna turn off my ringer entirely. So, um, right. So, um, Trump influences a lot of Republican voters to kind of follow his lead on issues. But many of his foreign policies are unpopular with Democrats and independents, and it's leading Democrats and independents to value international cooperation more. So there's an interesting pattern in the public opinion data where support for what I would call kind of core pillars of the international order, like alliances, trade, international cooperation generally, is higher now among Democrats among independents than it was say 10, 15 years ago. And I think that's because of people kind of recoiling against some of the things that Trump is doing and seeing that Trump is hurting the US standing in the world. Most voters, most Americans do say in polls that they think the US standing in the world is declining under Trump. And so while many Republicans are following Trump, it's sort of strengthening appreciation for international cooperation among some other parts of the electorate.
And you have to imagine that, like, the number of Democrats and independents who have been, like, negatively polarized to support international institutions like, the rules-based world order, is probably greater than the number of Republicans who have been, kind of motivated against those pillars of foreign policy.
Yeah, I think that's right. And overall, we now see levels of public support for alliances, for trade, higher than they've been in all of the years of Chicago Council polling, which is counterintuitive because I think for many people, it looks like the United States is entering a more isolationist period. It looks like we're pulling back from the world, and we are in a lot of respects under Trump. And so one might assume that that's what the public wants, or that the public, um, elected Trump because the public wanted the United States to retreat from the world. That's not actually the case, and so there's still a kind of foundation of public support for a more internationalist approach to the world, which can include renewed engagement with international institutions. International institutions are an area where there's a huge partisan split now. So, I mean, generally, Democrats are very supportive of the UN, of other multilateral organizations, of international treaties to address transnational problems, and Republicans are, at a minimum skeptical, if not, strongly opposed to a lot of um, venues of international um, cooperation. But across the board, Americans do kind of recognize that the United States needs allies and partners, that it can't kind of do everything by itself. And so that gives me some hope that future leaders can kind of bring the United States to a different orientation to the world and have the public with them.
I do want to get to that because that's the premise of an essay that you wrote accompanying these survey
Yeah,
results. I do first though want to ask you about China.
yeah.
Is there like a meaningful partisan divide on China, and what does that look like?
There there is a partisan divide on China, um, but there's also areas of agreement around China. So most Democrats and most Republicans see China as a challenge and a threat to some extent. Most Americans are worried about competition with China. see China as a security competitor and as an economic competitor, and worry about loss of jobs, vis-a-vis China. So there's concern about China among Democrats and Republicans. But Republicans see China as a greater threat. The concern is more amplified on the Republican side. And Republicans, in particular, are more skeptical about the possibility of cooperating with China. So most Democrats see China as a concern, but they think the solution is to engage China, find areas of agreement, try to address problems with China. Most Republicans think cooperation with China is not very feasible. We need to, just outcompete them in the security sense and an economic sense.
Um, I have so many questions. Okay, so that
Yeah,
actually leads me to another question, which is around like global development,
yeah,
and like American support for foreign aid. You know, I used to joke like the two areas of bipartisan consensus in American politics were support for Israel and its support for global health. Both of those
yes,
seem to have like evaporated and eroded
yes.
over the last several years, and really like dramatically over the last year. Since January 24th of last year, when Donald Trump issued an executive order virtually eliminated American foreign aid for global health and development issues. Um, what kind of do Americans think about foreign aid as determined by this uh, survey?
Yeah. Americans um, overall think the United States should provide foreign aid to other countries. Americans for years have had some big misunderstandings about foreign aid. Americans tend to think the United States provides way more foreign aid than it actually does. When you ask Americans, what share of the federal budget do you think is spent on foreign aid? Most Americans say 20, 25%, when the reality is under 1%. And that remains true today. There is a partisan split on aid, though. Democrats are more supportive of foreign aid than Republicans, particularly development and humanitarian aid. Military aid is a different matter. But speaking to kind of development and humanitarian aid, Democrats are considerably more supportive than Republicans for the same reason that Democrats are more supportive than domestic social welfare programs. They, believe government has more of a role
Mm-hmm.
to play in addressing social problems. Um, Sadly, the cuts to foreign aid that Trump has pursued have not um, generated a lot of sustained public attention. And so, it's not a highly salient issue. It's not one that Americans are going to be voting on in
So it
this coming election.
did it not have that same kind of like negative polarization effect where Democrats became like more strongly pro foreign aid because of this?
Um, uh, it was already an issue that was fairly polarized among the public, and it's more so now. Yeah, Trump kind of amped up the polarization by making it a more politicized issue.
Mhm,
It is an issue where for years there was bipartisan support in the United States Congress, in particular for
mhm.
global health programs, as you pointed out. That's frayed in part because of Trump kind of injecting politicization in. And one of the things that happens on a lot of foreign policy is when the president starts talking about a foreign policy issue in a politicized way, meaning trying to score political points on it or attacking the other party on it, then that tends to cause the public to split along partisan lines, and that's
Yeah.
that's what we've seen, especially under Trump.
Yeah, I wrote this essay earlier in the year in the wake of all this, for Frederick Ebert Stiftung, the German think tank
Hmm.
organization, kind of making the argument, making the point that, global health and development spending was not something that most of the public was really well aware of, but it's something certainly that, foreign policy elites, members of Congress, were keenly interested in because they, I think, understood the value it gave back to the United States. But, and again, it was always bipartisan, like a highly bipartisan issue. Like the most successful foreign aid program is, PEPFAR, the President's
Right.
Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief that George W. Bush, did back in the early 2000s. But now it's become a partisan issue with virtually no Republican elites supporting foreign aid like they used to, and Democrats supporting foreign aid more than ever at like the congressional level. And you just now have this kind of split where there used to not be a split. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if there are areas in which like the kind of elite bipartisan consensus still exists, and whether or not that diverges in some way or another from what like the public thinks about the issue.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, um, there used to be, I'd say, more areas where there was an elite public split. It used to be the case that elites were more supportive of international trade than the public, for instance. We actually don't see that as much now because the data is showing the public also supports international trade. Overall, elites have long been more internationalist than the public, have been more committed to international engagement. I think that remains largely true, but Trump has kind of injected some fracturing into that, um, into that pattern by um, pulling some Republican elites to a more nationalist, America First orientation. So, the kind of worldview that a J.D. Vance articulates is not one that you heard really at the elite level. At least not from mainstream politicians until recently, and now you have some Republicans like Vance articulating an approach to the world that really departs from an internationalist consensus. So, um, generally, I think there remains pretty broad elite consensus in support of international engagement, partners, alliances, but that's weakening a bit because of Trump.
Mhm. So I want to ask you about your essay accompanying
Yeah.
this survey, in which you identify areas of where there is like a potential way forward in terms
Yeah.
of where there's kind of like broad support for certain foreign policy principles, and how the mechanisms in which politicians may harness that popular support.
Yeah. So I think what the public opinion data show is that there's a strong foundation of public support for an approach to the world that prioritizes international cooperation. Americans understand that the United States cannot solve the world's problems by itself. And at the same time, they recognize that these problems need to be addressed, and they want to work with other countries to try to address the problems. So the survey data shows that um, in most Americans, for instance, think the United States should consult with its major allies before making important foreign policy decisions. And so um, a, a foreign policy vision that kind of centers international cooperation can attract broad um, public support. At the same time, um, a foreign policy vision that resonates with most Americans needs to make Americans feel that their leaders are protecting them. That's what Trump tapped into, this feeling that like I'm the one who's going to protect you. And so a foreign policy vision that's effective for the public will need to foreground international cooperation and also kind of underscore that you can be safe, and so that means that the United States also still needs to maintain a military that is powerful, and the other kind of issue that I think should be part of a forward-looking foreign policy vision is the role of technology and how that intersects with foreign policy. So traditionally, foreign policy thinkers have not tended to spend much time thinking about technological innovation, but um, surveys show that what a lot of Americans are most insecure today about is, the role of AI. How is this going to, threaten their jobs or threaten, the American way of life? And so I think future leaders would be wise to um, kind of have the way they think and talk about foreign policy connect to the way AI and other technologies are kind of changing the world, and how the U.S., engagement with other countries connects to technological innovation, especially on the economic front, where Americans have a lot of insecurity. So, kind of big picture, um, uh, there's a lot of support for a foreign policy vision that centers international cooperation. Um, in addition, Americans have some insecurities, some kind of deep insecurities, including some, ones around new technologies. And I think leaders need to kind of explain how foreign policy can, help protect Americans from those kinds of concerns.
Well, Jordan, this was fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. And a big thank you to the Chicago Council for doing this survey so consistently for the last 50 years.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to talk with you, Mark. Thanks so much for having me on.
And for those of you on the live stream, thank you for joining. You can support these kinds of conversations by getting a paid subscription to Global Dispatches. Every individual paid subscription goes a very long way to help me keep producing this kind of fascinating content. So thank you all for watching. And thank you again, Jordan. We'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
All right. Bye.